Welcome back, lead listeners. Where the hell have you been? Well, today's discussion is as critical as ever. How can we avoid the entrenched, extreme and organized lawlessness seen in Mexico and Brazil? Because global crime expert Julian Rademeyer warns the recent years' series of assassinations point to a worrying trend here at home. But there is still time to act.
I don't think it's a case of, having yet another task team being set up. I think we need to have specialized units with specialized skills, with the necessary informer networks to do targeted investigations into these kinds of crimes. We have to protect whistleblowers and witnesses better. I mean, that in itself is shocking, the number of witnesses who are gunned down. We need to safeguard judicial independence, and that's something that I think in many cases assassinations tend to erode.
Later in the show, is South Africa and US trade dead in the water, or is it all systems AGOA for a new agreement? And finally, we remember the Tulbagh earthquake from 1969 with On This Day in South African History, courtesy South African History Online.
New episodes of The Lead air Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m.
Let's get on with the show. My name's Graeme Raubenheimer, this is The Lead, and this is the South African story. Moving to our top story today, there are some signs that South Africa is now heading down the Latin American route following the recent assassinations of some key societal figures. From Babita Deokaran to Bouwer van Niekerk, global crime experts warn that the targeting of whistleblowers, prosecutors, activists and even journalists, well, it all weakens the very foundation of democracy. Now, to take stock of the lessons one can learn from Mexico, for example, we're joined live on the line now by Julian Rademeyer. He's the East and Southern African Director for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, otherwise known as GI-TOC. Julian, thanks so much for your time and welcome to The Lead.
Thanks for having me on, Graeme.
Fantastic. Look, your piece over the weekend, in case our News 24 subscribers have not read it yet, is entitled A Warning from Mexico and Brazil, Stop Assassination Epidemic Before It's Too Late. It definitely ties up a lot of thinking that we as journalists have had for quite a while now, bringing in pertinent facts and global examples. To start it all off, I mean, it seems like assassinations are becoming more commonplace these days. Do we have a figure to put to it? What does the research suggest before we sort of go overseas to the global examples?
Yeah, I think South Africa, I would say that assassinations are all too common, frighteningly common. We've been tracking assassinations as an organization since 2000, and we've recorded around 2,500 assassinations in that period. Just as a caveat, though, that is very likely an undercount. Many killings, particularly in rural areas, go unreported. We are heavily dependent on, open source information, be it press statements or news articles. So, that is not the exact figure. The real figure would likely be higher. And we break those assassinations down into four categories: essentially taxi-related shootings, political assassinations, organized crime assassinations, and so-called personal hits, which are, essentially cases where someone hires a hitman instead of a divorce lawyer, or in cases, where there's, an abusive relationship and someone tries to leave that relationship and they gun down. So it has become extremely worrying. I think that what we're seeing today is an increase in the profile of some of the people that are being assassinated, and then also the brazenness of those assassinations. We've gone from people being gunned down when they're most vulnerable in their driveways leaving for work to, in the case of Bouwer van Niekerk, for instance, being shot dead in the boardroom of his law firm, or in a recent case in Cape Town, witness in a case being shot dead inside the courtroom while they waited to testify.
Yeah. And why do you think that perhaps the figure, and yes, oftentimes in journalism, we also sort of have that same caveat that, the figure could possibly be a lot bigger. Is that down to the fact that, policing in South Africa, as we know it, and of course we've got the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry breaking that wide open. We're sort of seeing it in its minutiae at the moment. Those failures of policing in this country, is it down to the fact that the police just don't have the capacity to open as many cases, or is it really also a mix of the nefarious elements of such assassinations, and that it is just simply done under cloak and dagger and so difficult to follow up?
I think it's a mixture of all of those. Certainly, when it comes to policing and police crime statistics, there's no way that you can disaggregate assassinations from ordinary murders just simply by going into the police caste system. There are attempts to do that now, and some of those are being highlighted, obviously, at the Madlanga Commission. But police simply don't have the capacity to investigate murders in South Africa, let alone targeted assassinations. You're looking at between 10 and 14% of murder dockets being closed every year, which is astonishing that so few cases are being successfully investigated and closed.
Right. Okay, let's move a little bit to those global examples that we sort of look to. At home, of course, Babita Deokaran being such a pertinent figure that has in itself a story that has led to this Madlanga Commission. We've of course seen two other Ekurhuleni financial auditors also come under targeting by assassinations within the Gauteng East Rand area. What does the Mexico sort of case study reveal about what life is like there on an organized crime scale, and how does that sort of relate to South Africa, Julian?
Yeah, I think what Mexico shows is that once assassinations become embedded in society, and once they become a way of doing things, they significantly undermine any attempts at democracy. The impunity with which assassinations are carried out in Mexico has a significant corrosive effect. They've, in many cases, around 95% of crimes recorded against journalists and activists in Mexico go unpunished. Prosecutors have come to treat assassinations, they're almost as common crimes, something that is akin to a murder rather than something that is actually an attack in many cases on law enforcement or on whistleblowers, on the state itself. And the chilling effect that has is enormous. It sends a message to anyone that, if you speak out, if you try and confront, particularly in this case, the narco cartels or the politicians who've been corrupted by those drugs cartels, you will be killed. And that's, a message time and time again that extraordinarily brave journalists in Mexico have had to confront, and whistleblowers and others.
It really feels like within the Mexican space, for the lack of a Hollywood, film sort of trope or stereotype without falling into that, there is this really fierce contestation for the more rural areas or the local government towns. And in South Africa at the moment, and I'm not saying it's the same thing, but there is something that sort of harks to that within the sense of, and I don't know if you saw these headlines recently, Julian, of a Northwest Council gunman on two different sides of a political warring factions, trying to gain control of a local council within the Northwest. And recently we had some parliamentarians go up there and sort of been quite appalled, quote unquote, shocked, the Ramaphosa administration slogan, if you will, about the state of affairs in the Northwest. It feels like, when we don't have a closer watch on these nodes of budgets that are availed to the public, when we don't have a closer look on these smaller towns and town councils, it really feels like criminality can seep in quite quickly.
Exactly. I mean, to put in a bit of perspective, in last year's election cycle in Mexico, the country experienced its highest number of political murders in modern history, 63 assassinations of political figures. If you look at the period between 2018 and 2023, 77% of municipal candidates standing for election in Mexico were victims of some form of aggression, either violent attacks or attempted assassinations. And there were around 836 assassinations, or 836 attacks recorded, not assassinations. I think that in South Africa, if you look at the figures there too, if you go back to the last sort of few years, 2019, we recorded around 40 assassinations, 2020 another 24, 2022 around 40, 2023 a similar number. And I think that all of those deaths are motivated by a battle over scarce resources. Most of our assassinations tend to cluster around local government elections. It's very rare cases. I mean, the 2019 election in South Africa is one such example where we had a higher number of assassinations taking place in a national election year. But generally, they tend to cluster around local government elections. And I think that's, it's around access to tenders, and in some cases, increasingly scarce tenders. Becoming a councillor in many ways guarantees someone a lucrative salary, particularly if you think of more rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, where assassinations are particularly high. I mean, KwaZulu-Natal leads political assassinations across the country. So all of that ties into vying for those opportunities. I think it's also complicated, but when you try and look at assassinations, often there's a bit of a crossover between different categories. As I said earlier, we've got 4 categories we focus on. But you'll find that in some cases, municipal councillors are assassinated not because of their political role, but because they, for instance, happen to have involvement in the taxi industry. Or there are cases where you have, political figures who have an overlapping role in organized crime. An example from Mpumalanga, for instance, is a chief who was assassinated there 2 years ago. He was very actively involved in both the taxi industry, organized crime, including extortion and rhino poaching, and was also a newly appointed chief. And he was assassinated, and then several members of his family were later assassinated. So it can be very complex to try and work out the motive for a killing.
But, I mean, the point remains, it's the contestation over, the resources in general, especially in a country like South Africa where the economy is not doing so great at the moment, etc., and all those socioeconomic issues come to play. Just a quick comment as well, and of course, talking about KwaZulu-Natal, the very reason why we have the Matlanga Commission at the moment is this, belief or allegations put forward by that provincial police commissioner that the task team that he was leading and doing so well in terms of the conviction rate and investigating these sort of high profile cases, that it's alleged that there was some sort of political interference, and that's why we're having this commission today. So the timing of this piece that you guys had penned, just sort of bringing it together, is so pertinent at such a critical time that we keep having these discussions. How is it that Brazil is quite similar? I find it so interesting. You start talking about this 2018 case of a Rio de Janeiro city councillor, a human rights activist, Marielle Franco. He was said to be a rising political star at the time, and was challenging the very vestiges of power, and then also came under fire. God forbid we haven't really seen something as brazen in terms of high profile of political ward councillors within our major metros in South Africa just yet within our democracy. And if it does get to that point, that's when I think, alarm bells would be ringing a lot louder.
Yeah, well, I think we have seen, assassinations that are, as high profile and as brazen. And I think what's interesting in that particular case is the overlap between, the Brazil organized crime militias and the police, and the involvement of a number of former police officers in her assassination and Marielle Franco's assassination. What's worrying in a South African context too is that the number of cases have continued to grow where you see either serving police officers or police officers, who have been in the police service at some point, being used as hitmen or being, selling their services as hitmen. One example would be, the assassination of Mark Liffman, the Cape Town gang boss, where, allegedly a former member of the police task force is involved. We have had other cases where, senior police officials have been implicated in assassinations in Gauteng and elsewhere.
This former police detective who's currently behind bars, Julian, just to your point, Michael Puletau, a former detective, part of this alleged death squad, allegedly led by Katiso Katie Molefe. So there's yet another example, right?
Exactly. So I think that's something that should really concern us, is the role that, police officials play in some of these assassinations. I think that Brazil is also, because of the enormous disparities that exist there, very similar to South Africa. So in some ways, it's possibly a better model than Mexico. But Brazil has seen, the growing strength of these militias attacks on activists and environmental defenders who've been assassinated, the prison gangs that have grown, incredibly strong. Some of them, like the Primero Comando de Capital, the PCC, or the Comando Vermelho, the Red Command, who are also transnational drug trafficking organizations, and some of them with roots into Southern Africa, as an aside. But they have become powerful as drug cartels, but they've also become powerful politically, shoring up campaigns, paying off politicians, filling the void in many cases that's left by an absent police force or left by the state. And I think that certainly in South Africa and in parts of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal again being one example and Mpumalanga being another good example, there are these gaps that are being filled by criminal networks, where the police are either too afraid or too corrupt or too, uninvolved to really fill any gap, and that's filled by criminal groups. The same goes for where the political classes have stepped back and essentially abandoned communities. Who do you turn to if you need a loan or if you need medicine for your kids? It's the gangs that can begin to control a lot of that and start offering sort of quasi-state services. And running a parallel illicit economy. And we're in real danger around those elements too, which all of that then feeds into the cycle of violence and these markets for violence that create a pool of hitmen and killers that are available for a range of different tasks.
You're listening to the latest edition of The Lead on News 24 with Graeme Raubenheimer. If you've got an opinion on what you've heard so far, drop us a short voice note on our WhatsApp hotline. That's 072 562 3179.
Welcome back. This is The Lead. This is the South African story. My name's Graeme Raubenheimer, in conversation with Julian Rademeyer with GI-TOC, discussing the concerning parallels between Latin America and potentially South Africa when we look specifically at political assassinations and the socioeconomic issues around all of this. Are we falling into the same trap? Let's pick up the conversation now. And of course, we've also known for such a long time that these, most notably the prison-based gangs, still have this, sort of macro influence over the criminal landscape within a country, and even further than that, I find it fascinating that, of course, the Brazilian example, and you're reminding us of that in the piece, is so similar to the Cape Town one. You may have seen this headline recently from the mayor, Jordan Hill-Lewis. He's now calling on the Correctional Services Minister. He wants cell phone signal jamming at Pollsmoor Prison. I mean, these are things we've known about for a really long time, that prisoners, most notably, the numbers gangs leaders, are still getting their hands on cell phones. The raids prove this, and they're still sort of conducting their allegedly nefarious activities.
Yeah, I think it's pretty true to say that there's not a single prisoner in a South African correctional service facility who doesn't have access in some way, shape or form to a cell phone. They're lucrative for renting them out. They allow people to conduct their businesses. Wardens smuggle them in for your more high-profile inmates. Gangs run their businesses very effectively from behind prison walls. And that includes taking out hits on witnesses, or rivals.
Okay, so now how do we, such a tall question to ask, Julian, excuse me, how do we sort of reverse the pattern, stop the pattern from getting worse in terms of the hallmark similarities that South Africa is seeing with the Latin American examples that we've just alluded to? What are the stopgap measures? Is the door still open for stopping that? And I think the Madlanga Commission, and I've said this before in previous chats here on The Lead, whatever you think about it, whether or not you think it's a waste of time, at least at the very basis of it all, at least we're having a discussion in the open about the intricacies of and failures of our SA Police Service, and hopefully that gives us a blueprint to be better in future, right? So yeah, to your point, and to the piece on News 24, what are those sort of prescribed elements you think, or factors, that would best suit us at this point?
Absolutely. I'd agree with you on the Madlanga Commission. I think, whatever you believe around Mkonazi's allegations and others, probably the more valuable thing that comes out of this is a really focused look at the decline of the South African Police Service, what is going on within it, the scourge of assassinations that has been going on for far too long across South Africa. I think it's incredibly difficult challenge to face, especially when you've reached a point where assassinations have become so entrenched as a way of doing business. If you have a business rival, get them taken out, rather than taking them on in a business sense. Or if you have a political rival who you feel, is gaining access to more tenders than you, have them taken out. And that's become frighteningly, as I said, something that we see in all aspects of society, where we're now reaching, around 140, 150 assassinations a year. I think it's vital that we have targeted investigations into these pools of hitmen. You have, hitmen being recruited from a number of different areas, but the taxi industry is a prime example, both in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. Gangs in the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and Gauteng, also recruiting ground for hitmen. I don't think it's a case of, having yet another kind of grouping of police who are going to, or another task team being set up. I think we need to have specialized units with specialized skills, with the necessary informer networks to do targeted investigations into these kinds of crimes. We have to protect whistleblowers and witnesses better. I mean, that in itself is shocking, the number of witnesses who are gunned down. We need to safeguard judicial independence, and that's something that I think in many cases assassinations tend to erode. And I think there's generally a sort of contention in South African society, and I think overwhelmingly many people who are completely and utterly frustrated with the scale of criminality in the country, and the violence that we see,
and lack of accountability. Just to add,
and lack of accountability, exactly. Is that we, shoot to kill policies are fine. Police should go out there and shoot criminals. If you look at the case of Brazil, where effectively a tacit shoot to kill policy has been in place for a very long time, in 2024 alone, police shot and killed over 6,000 people. They accounted for around 14% of homicides in Brazil. And yet that has done absolutely nothing to weaken the criminal organizations involved. So we need to get back to a situation, and unfortunately it's going to be a long struggle, where our justice system is seen to be swift, it's seen to be transparent, it's seen to be fair, and it's seen to take action. And that can only be done with significant reforms within the South Africa Police Service, within the prosecuting authority, in the justice sector, and so on. And then on top of that, I think that we need to understand the role that journalists play and civil society play in flagging and tracking these kinds of killings. We've certainly worked with civil society activists in KwaZulu-Natal and elsewhere over the years, who've almost single-handedly tracked assassinations. Similarly, you've seen the work that News 24 has been doing in its investigations into a number of high-profile assassinations, 100%. Including that of Bouwer van Niekerk. That is so vital, to keep authorities on their toes, to keep the focus on these issues. But it's really going to be very, very hard work to try and rebuild the public's trust in institutions, to get prosecutions going, to make sure that dockets don't disappear. This, crazy case recently in Cape Town, where a group of alleged hitmen from KwaZulu-Natal were arrested with AK-47s, and then subsequently released. How can that be?
Yes, and the revelations, Julian, that some of these guns are coming via Namibia. I mean, tickle me curious. Obviously, it would be only a matter of time after the previous scandal, and you perhaps know a bit more detail off the top of the head, of the police armory being raided and those guns being resold, the confiscated guns being resold, and now we're getting guns from Namibia. It's quite crazy. To the point of extrajudicial killings. I mean, here you have Umkonazi from the Madlanga Commission, as we sort of wrap up, also being accused by investigator Paul O'Sullivan of leading extrajudicial killings in KwaZulu-Natal. And at the same time, you have a correctional services minister who's also been entertaining the idea of the death penalty again. I mean, that's also a conversation that doesn't really go away within the South African context. I thought it's so pertinent that you raised that point, that these aren't necessarily quick fixes to stopping and untangling the entrenched crime webs, right?
No, they're not. And I think, sadly, so much of the focus is on, trying to find a quick solution. These very reactive approaches that lack any real strategic response, where an incident happens, take illegal mining and that horrific incident a couple of years ago in Krugersdorp where a number of women were gang raped, allegedly by illegal miners, and there was a sudden crackdown by police. That crackdown went away. Very little has changed. We are seeing encouragingly, at the level of the DPCI and the Hawks, some high-level investigations going into some of the syndicates that are involved in illegal mining. But it's taken a very long time to get to that point. And I think the same goes, with so many of the illicit economies that our country has to deal with. The focus is on the low-level foot soldiers. The focus is on making arrests and chasing statistics. The focus is not on building complex corruption and organized crime cases against the people that are actually driving these syndicates that are playing a significant role. I mean, I think that there are good examples that we can look at. Some of the takedowns that have happened in the Western Cape, for instance, against leading gang figures, Modak, Liffman and others over time. But we need so much more of that. And the thing is that, you can't simply have one or two big cases and then focus on the low-level cases. There needs to be a level of consistency. So that is our real challenge going forward, is having the right skills, having the right people who can pursue these investigations, and getting rid of the infighting that really cripples so much of within the South Africa Police Service, certainly at a leadership level among the commissioners, where you have people who are contesting their positions, who are trying to entrench their positions, who are fighting, petty political struggles with other commissioners. All of that does very little other than hamstring the police. We've seen what's happened in the police crime intelligence unit, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's, we have hit a critical point, and I think that the current Minister of Police, the new Minister of Police, is very much aware of this, and hopefully we have the right people in terms of the advisors that he has, in terms of what the Madlanga Commission is looking into, to really push for significant reforms, because we simply cannot go on as we have in recent years, where these criminal economies take root and become so embedded, and very little action is taken against them.
Final question, is the devolution of national policing powers to a provincial government, like within the context of what the DA in the Western Cape is pushing for, the devolution of those powers, is that a positive political policy prescription for the problem, or does that add into the murkiness of it all?
I think it can be both. I think, it depends entirely how well the province is run, and whether, or cities are run. I mean, certainly the city of Cape Town has built up an impressive, investigative capacity to look at a range of crimes, in many cases supporting the work of the South African Police Service. But other areas, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, would they be as equipped to run, an effective law enforcement agency that could, at a provincial or local level, that could have an impact? I think that's one of the challenges that we will have to face. But certainly we need to look at how we can best improve the capacity of police and investigators, bring in the sorts of skills that we need in a modern organized crime environment, where you have very sophisticated criminal networks that are involved, where we can, bring in the kinds of financial investigators we need to follow the money, and where we can build up, have the intelligence capacity on the ground to actually, gather information on hitmen, assassins, and organized crime groupings.
Sure. And that's Julian Rademeyer, is the East and Southern African Director for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, otherwise known as GI-TOC, with the very latest piece. In case you missed it, it still makes for excellent reading. Our weekend essay, a warning from Mexico and Brazil: stop assassination epidemic before it's too late. I hope we don't have to get to another high-profile case before we have these similar discussions again. Julian, thank you so much for your time right here on The Lead on News 24, and I hope to get more of your insight as the Madlanga Commission ekes on into the future. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Graeme.
Trending topic.
Moving to our trending topic now, and is AGOA a goner? Well, if recent reports from News 24 specialist business journalist Carol Payton are anything to go by, it appears that there's potential for the US to extend its preferential trade deal with South Africa this week by at least 2 years. Our trade authorities have been in more concrete consultation with the Trump administration as of late. As it stands, there are a couple of contested products currently up for grabs on the negotiation table. They include better US access to our livestock market and vice versa, a promise from us to buy more American LP gas. Besides this, there's word that AGOA may benefit us still, although in practice we're not yet sure how, with Trump's unprecedented 30% tariff slap still stinging South Africa's face. Washington DC insiders also say there's no suggestion just yet to say if South Africa would even be excluded if AGOA is extended, given that it covers the entire continent. They add too that all of this largely hinges on Trump himself's attitude on the day, because for now, AGOA's imminent absence will be a blow to our local auto manufacturing, wine, citrus and nuts exporters, which may cost us thousands of jobs. Is this the end of the line, or do you think we could still strike somewhat of a deal? What do you think? Drop us a voice note, 072 562 3179.
And finally,
ending off with On This Day in History. Well, on this day, the 29th of September 1969, the Boerland towns of Tulbagh, Wolseley and Ceres were rocked by the most destructive earthquake in this country's history. Just after 10 p.m. at night, the 6.3 magnitude tremor struck near Saron, sending shockwaves across the Western Cape. Now, 9 people were killed, dozens injured, historic buildings collapsed, including the La Ruin farmhouse built in 1785. With little knowledge of earthquakes then, disaster management was almost non-existent, but South Africans at the time rallied. Aid had poured in and Tulbagh's Kerkstraat was rebuilt, today standing as a living reminder of resilience after tragedy. That's On This Day in History, the 29th of September 1969, courtesy South African History Online. If you've got a lot more on your mind and don't feel like sending a voice note, you can mail us to thelead@24.com. Got 3 more shows like clockwork this week, so stay tuned for that. You can do so by hitting like, follow and subscribe on Spotify, Apple and YouTube. My name's Graeme Raubenheimer, and so long as there's trusted news first, we'll have The Lead.